There are, in addition to the two facilitators being myself and Greg Klatt, we do also have a couple of note takers. They are playing a very useful function in support of the report that we will be writing up that needs to eventually be submitted in the PUC docket. And I believe that last meeting, the two note takers were Barkovich and Desiree Wong from Edison. Today, I think Desiree is not available, so my colleague Brian Rothstein is stepping in her role. Beyond the facilitators and note takers, a request to all participants. So we are going to be muting all of you at the beginning to avoid background noise. But if you need to ask clarifying questions, etc., please use the raise hand feature. Okay, the facilitators will pick it up and pause the conversation if it's a clarifying question. To the extent possible, please hold off on your discussion questions until later. Today, we have deliberately set aside the last hour for a discussion period, in part because today will be sort of like the more substantive, more meaty day, focusing on specific, framework ideas, etc. And so, we're not trying to prevent you from raising, clarifying questions, etc. But to the extent you are offering your input, opinion, or thoughts, perhaps the best time to do that would be at the end of the meeting today. And then Greg will go over additional logistics, but we are going to be inviting informal comments on today's conversation. So you will have an opportunity to, write up and submit your informal comments in a few days. So with that, Greg, why don't I pass it on to you, both to introduce yourself and to go over the workshop schedule in general and today's agenda.
Thanks, Deval. You've covered just about everything. I think all I would add is just a reminder that if you'd like to present at the upcoming workshop 2 weeks from now on resource counting, please let the facilitators know that by this Friday, close of business. And also, the facilitators will need your workshop slides, not this Friday, but next Friday. And I say the facilitators in the third person because Deval and I are just co-facilitators for these 2 workshops on structural elements. So I'll be back to my usual role as an advocate for WPTF after this. We have a recap. So the next 2 workshops are on resource counting. Then I think we have, is it after those 2 that we have the recap, or are we going to do need and resource allocation? Do you remember?
Yeah, so we are doing, okay, so the next 2 workshops are on resource counting. Then we essentially invite 1 informal round of comments on structural elements and resource counting workshops. Then need determination and allocation follow that, and then the recap on everything slides a day is on December 15th.
Great. So
and there'll be 1 more round of informal comments, etc. So in a deck that we had shared along with the meeting materials, all this is captured, the overall workshop schedule.
That's right. And we'll send that out again as the time approaches, just so everyone has it readily accessible. The timing, the due dates for informal comments and all that. Just like previously, let's say, gosh, Deval, you pretty much covered everything. I think we go ahead and jump right in. We do have 4 presentations today.
Yes.
So 4 presentations, the first by PG&E on some different options in terms of key components of slice of day and some analysis and a proposed metric for looking at the different ways to slice up the seasons and the days and be able to have a sense of how much you're losing accuracy when you go to longer periods, both in terms of the hours of the day and seasons. Vistra will be giving a presentation on principles, but really with a focus on compatibility with the commercial procurement realities that most of you are familiar with, having gone through RA procurement on either side for a long time, and sometimes both sides. And then the CAISO will be giving a presentation, and I believe the focus there it will be on the interaction between RA showings and their CIRA portal, and what some of the limitations are, or what their proposal is in terms of what the focus should be for a slice of day. And then lastly, Edison will be giving a presentation and making the case for 24 hourly slices. So it's going to be a jam-packed day. Right. Looking forward to all the input from the parties. Again, you will have an opportunity to provide informal comments. Deval and I will be preparing the section of the workshop report that's due in February on the 2 days of structural elements. And then be sure, like I said, when you provide your notification to the co-facilitators, take a look at the previously sent around emails. I think Lisa had sent them, Lisa Wan, about who you need to send those notifications to, in addition to PG&E. So I think with that, let's go ahead and jump in.
Sounds good. And then one other just small additional comment. We are going to take a lunch break from noon to 12:30. We are deliberately keeping it short so that we can move the overall conversation along. But yeah, we plan to break at noon and then resume at 12:30. So with that, Greg, that's absolutely correct. One other minor comment. So each presenter is going to be showing their slides on the screen rather than facilitators showing them on their behalf. So I will request PG&E to get ready to share their screen and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. This is Peter Griffiths from PG&E. I am presenting on behalf of PG&E in terms of where we are and various aspects of this. So Luke, why don't you go ahead and go to the next slide? What I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about sort of slices and seasons, and to talk a little bit about metrics as to how you think about what is acceptable or what might not be acceptable for slices and seasons in terms of how they're defined and what they are doing. We also introduce a couple of straw proposals for the framework. These are basically suggestions that look at sort of different ways it could be set up. The focus of these particular straw proposals is keeping the number of showings relatively small, and that may or may not be a desirable aspect of this. So what we're really trying to do is to deepen the discussion, have more discussion about what's important to parties, and to basically have a better idea of exactly how some of these things can be parameterized going forward. So next slide, please, Luke. Principles and summaries. I want to talk a little bit about the principles. Next slide. The principles that we have and that are listed here, these are the principles that were in the PUC's decision regarding the reform to the RA framework. And I notice, or the one thing I want to point out here, I mean, I think we've all seen these. I think we're all familiar with them. I want to point out to some degree that the first three of these essentially all start with the word balance, or at least they're set up in a way to look at balancing. And so, on the one hand, we're balancing reliability with cost. We're also balancing sort of, making sure that we get every hour, to making sure that we're also doing some, advancing environmental goals, also getting the granularity and needs and simplicity. All of these things are are things that need to be balanced and need to be taken into account and should be part of the discussion of how do we do that balance? How are we balancing? And I think the more explicit we can be about sort of what we think that balance is and what the trade-offs are, I think the better we can understand each other and to essentially be able to lay out sort of options that try and get at that right balance and have a discussion about that. Also, sort of implementation is an important key to this. We want to make sure that we can be put into place. We are moving from a world where we do have an RA structure to one that's going to be a new RA structure. We have to think about some of that transition as well. And sort of durability. That was the final thing in terms of what the commission put forward for consideration and making sure. And we'll talk a little bit. We're going to do a little bit talk a little bit about that and how things might look in 2030 with regards to some of this. So, Luke, can you go to the next slide, please? In terms of the evaluation and in terms of how we're trying to get at this, we have reliability, we have cost effectiveness, we have hourly sufficiency, we have environmental goals, we have a number of different aspects of this, and to some degree, what we're trying to do here is to give an idea of how we're trying to address some of these aspects that are important to keep in place. So, reliability, using a forecast and the maximum forecast for what the load could be makes some sense to be able to make sure that there is reliability on the one hand. On the other hand, we need to make sure that what the showings are actually going to be representative of what the requirements or what the load is likely to be. And so we want to make sure that we are balancing sort of not having too much procurement in periods when it may not be necessary, but we do want to make sure we have enough procurement to have a reliable system. Hourly sufficiency, to some degree, by thinking about sort of how storage is going to be charged and what that looks like, we're taking that into account. Environmental goals, we're depending upon sort of the thinking here is that we're moving away from a system that basically doesn't count the wind and solar very well in the RA framework to a framework where we are going to try and essentially capture a much better measure of what those types of resources can actually produce and actually contribute to reliability. Implementability, well, simplicity and transactability. This is something where I think there needs to be a lot of discussion in terms of what do people think are simple, how do they are going to be able to transact this, how is this likely to work? This is really very much dependent upon the LSEs and the producers, for the most part, providing input as to how hard is it going to be to transact and how hard is it going to be to do the requirements, to show the requirements. How hard is it going to be for Energy Division essentially to verify the requirements? And also, to some degree, are we keeping it relatively regularly lined up or lined up to some degree with what the ISO does? Largely because the focus here is on the PUC's RA program, which is a PUC program, and we're not necessarily suggesting changes to the ISO's RA program. There might be some adjustments the ISO might want to undertake, given what we decide, what the PUC decides, but we're not dictating to some degree that the ISO's RA program needs to change or change in a particular way. We're really just trying to design how can the PUC essentially set its RA program up to make sure that the right resources essentially are made available through the RA program. With the durability and adaptability, we're also thinking to a large degree, let's think about sort of what the needs are going to be on the system and what that is going to look like. So that's the way we've been thinking to some degree about some of the trade-offs or some of the balancing that we're thinking we're going to have to do. And we can get into this in a greater discussion and in the discussion period and talk about some of these things and how we're actually going to be trying to accomplish this. So next slide, please. What I'm going to do is basically, here's sort of the key elements that I'm going to go through. I'm going to talk a little bit about forecast. This should look familiar. This is not that different from what we presented in the last workshop. We're going to go into perhaps a bit more detail. And the one thing that's probably is different is that we've got a metric here where we're going to talk a little bit about a metric in terms of how do you know that you're getting the right definitions of slices and definitions of seasons. And we're basically going to be saying, okay, what are the different ways to look at that? You know, we're going to offer a metric that could capture some aspects of it. It won't necessarily capture all aspects, but it will be some sort of indication to sort of be able to compare across configurations of seasons and slices to be able to have some sort of idea of how it might work. We're also going to look to some degree at seasonal options and slice options. We're then going to talk about a couple of different straw proposals, which are seasonal straw proposals. And they're pretty much to illustrate sort of how the metric could work in that. And finally, we're going to give a very brief sort of discussion about how resource counting fits into the structural elements. Because from our perspective, and I think from the perspective as a whole, deciding on a particular structural element, it needs to go hand in hand with a lot of the other things that we're going to be talking about in later workshops, such as resource counting, such as sort of how we are setting up to make sure that we're getting the reliability that we want at the level that we want. And finally, we'll have a time for discussion and time for feedback. So that's where I'm going to give you a preview. So let's get started. Luke, let's go to the next slide. Key elements. In terms of the forecast, what we're proposing and sort of the way we're thinking about it is that we are using a maximum hourly values in a month or a season, basically, to be sort of the representative to set the requirement for that month or season. What we're using for this, and this is really illustrative because we're using the IPER forecast, ISO level forecast, essentially to provide the look, largely because it's what we have. It's a forecast that we have for currently, we have it for 2026. We also have it for 2030. And that's the basis in terms of the way we've been thinking about it and the way we have been setting it. Setting it at maximum values, as you'll recall from the last workshop, we talked about different ways you could set the requirement. Maximum values is one way to do it. Another way to do it is to think about worst day. What is the worst day in a particular month, seasons that you're going to be facing, and set the requirements based on that. Another is basically just what is the average requirement or average load in each of those days. So you know, those things are moving together. For the discussion today, we're going to be basing things on a maximum hourly value. We think that maximum hourly value probably is the right way to do it. So let's go to the next slide, please. And the reason why we think it's the right way to do it is largely because it's the way we do it now. For the most part, how do we set the resource adequacy requirements now on a monthly basis? We essentially look at what the peak demand is of the month, and it's that value that sets it for not just that day or that hour, but for all hours within the month. And so it basically is we're procuring now to a maximum value that we think could occur in a month. And what we're doing and how that translates to some degree to the slice of day, we would be essentially buying to what we think the maximum demand is going to be in that slice, in that season, monthly or seasonal period. And so it's not that far off in terms of using the maximum value from what we currently do. Here's a graph that we compare this against, and we did in the first workshop, where we compared sort of the worst day, and you have to define worst day. The way we've defined worst day here, and there are probably different ways to do it, is to say what day has the maximum demand, and we will take the load from that particular day and look at that and use that as the basis for setting the requirements for each of the hours that are going to be sort of in that month or in that season. If we're talking about months, and this is a calculation we've done, is basically look at what is the difference between essentially the requirement set by the maximum value as opposed to the worst day for each of the hours in each of the months. And what you see in the graph, or in the graphic for the most part, is that in the middle of the summer, there isn't a whole lot of difference in terms of what that difference is in terms of what the requirements are. But in some of the shoulder months, there is a difference. And part of that is just because there's variation within the month. And that variation within the month, if you only are looking at the worst day, that may be some set of hours where there might be a day in another set of the hours in that month that could be at a higher level or different. And so what this is illustrating to some degree, particularly in March, if you are basing it on the maximum of the hours in that month, then that gives you a different answer than if you are basing it on in the worst day. Particularly there, and that's, this is what we showed previously and where we are, and how we have assumed, or what we're assuming is essentially as a basis for using maximum day. So next slide, please. This slide basically, if we think about forecast, or we look at forecast, essentially what we're showing here is that the IRP analysis has identified sort of hours of concern that are in 2030. And the way the IRP has done this is to use the preferred system plan and the SERVM analysis for a particular case for 2030. And what it's calculating is the expected unserved energy by hour and by month. Now, what you see here is you see you see basically you do have unserved energy when you might expect it, which is basically in the June, July, August, September timeframe, particularly in that net load peak period. In the periods between sort of hour ending 16 to hour ending 23, and even hour ending 24 in a couple of cases there, or at least one case there in July. So that's when we would expect essentially there to be issues on the system, particularly as we move away, since we are moving to a mix of resources that would be much greater and much more heavily dependent on renewables. But what you also see is that in February, March, and April, there is expected loss load in hours that are not necessarily associated with the net peak. And those hours basically are sort of late in the morning or in the morning, when essentially, and perhaps before the sun has been able to come up and to be able to provide enough production, that there is the possibility of essentially of having outages or unserved energy in those hours. And this really highlights from PG&E's perspective the fact that we've got to look at a slice of day type of framework, where we got to look at a framework that deals with every hour of the day in terms of making sure there are enough resources to be able to meet those requirements. And so it's not just focusing on net peak will get you there. I think you also have to focus on sort of what hours of the day and how that could work. So let's move to the next slide, please. Let me move, and the next slide basically is to talk about gross and net load. Should the load curve be done on a gross basis or net basis? And this basically is, setting the requirements. Are we setting the requirements based on what? On what the load is that needs to be met? Or are we basically saying we're going to allow the system and or to allow the renewables essentially to come off to be able to meet the load, and essentially set the RA requirements based on the net load. what the net load does is it basically credits essentially what the production is in each hour from the renewable resources to that hour before setting the requirements that then have to be met after that. And so, you know, there are definitely some issues to consider here in terms of how it is looked at and how you think about this and what the procurement needs to be done. It is a bit more complicated to do things on a net load basis in terms of setting the requirements and meeting the requirements, because you have to think about, okay, how much wind and solar do we have? How much credit should we be giving to the wind and solar and renewables essentially to be able to lower what we think has to be procured from other types of resources to be able to meet the net load. And so there's some questions about transactability in terms of sort of, you know, on an LSE basis. These are all complications that I think need to be thought about when we're thinking about sort of whether it needs to be done on a gross or a net load basis. But the main difference for the most part is that on a net load basis, you are crediting essentially the renewables output to each hour that you expect it to have output. Next slide, please. This is basically an illustration of sort of how the net load is calculated. On the top graph, this is basically for summer 2026. We've got hourly, essentially the load there is in the red with the planning reserve margin in the requirement set. What you see in the lower graph essentially is the fact, and what you see in the lower graph is that when you create the net load and essentially set the requirements are basically based on what the maximum is of the net load. So the bottom graph essentially takes out the wind and the solar, and it takes it off of the red line at the top graph to get to the red line in the bottom graph, which then set the requirements, and those requirements on a slice by slice basis are indicated by the black dotted line. And so this is really just an illustration of sort of how it works in terms of if you're doing things on a gross load basis, you would be able to have to meet in the upper graph the red line, the red dotted line essentially, and you could use the wind and the solar resources to do that. In the bottom graph, if you're doing it on a net load basis, you would take the contribution of the wind and the solar out, and that would essentially then set the requirements that you would have to meet with other types of resources. And so that's the main difference between the gross load and the net load. We're going to pretty much show some differences. Mainly, I think we're going to be thinking about the straw proposals that we're putting forward. I think are based on the net load, but they doesn't have to be. And again, there's a complicating factor in terms of how do you think about how to do that calculation. And that gets into resource counting and how resource counting should work. So next slide, please. Metrics. Let me talk a little bit about metrics. What we're trying to do here is to select a season and slice design. Greg, I noticed you have your hand up. As a facilitator, you can feel free to jump in.
All right, thanks, Peter. Hey, just a quick question on the net load versus gross load basis.
Yep.
Would that be net load on a system basis or looking at individual LSE load forecasts? Because that's a complication that came up when we were looking at Edison's proposal. I think it'd be helpful to clarify that.
It depends. That's a really good question, and it depends to some degree about how you're setting the requirements. Because if it's going to be, and again, we're talking about a subject matter which is not in the next two workshops, but in the workshop after that, which is basically need determination or the need determination and allocation. It really depends to some degree on how you're thinking about how that should be done, whether it could be done on a top-down basis or on a bottom-up basis. If you're thinking about things as a bottom-up basis, you're doing everything on an LSE by LSE basis in looking at that. If you're doing it from a top-down, you still could do net load on a top down, but you would have to assume some generic shapes for your production of the wind and solar that would then be used to calculate the net load. And that could be done by looking at sort of what resources, what wind and solar resources there are in the system, and being able to essentially to have a representation of what their output could be across all hours that we're looking at, and essentially then use those generic those generic shapes essentially to be able to calculate the net load. So it could be done. It could be done either way. It does have an impact, and it does come into sort of the discussion about, oh, are we thinking about doing things on a top-down basis or a bottom-up basis? It would have an impact there.
Great, thanks.
Let me move to the metrics and talk about the metrics. What we've been trying to do for the most part is to come up with a way to show sort of how much variation there is in the period that the requirement is being set for. If the requirement is being set for a particular slice in a particular season, what is the variation in the load in that season and slice, or that seasonal slice? And how much variation is there? If you have a lot of variation and you're setting a requirement based on a maximum value, then essentially you could be thinking about, oh, I'm doing too much procurement, I'm over procuring. Whereas if I were to do it on a smaller slice or a different set of seasons or different set of months in the seasons, then that could essentially impact sort of getting to what you think might be needed in those periods. Now, that also has an impact on sort of reliability as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the discussion here. But because of the fact that if you get to finer and finer definitions of what the requirements are, you're going to put a lot more pressure for the most part on the load forecast that you're relying on as actually being right, and you're not building in enough or any buffer by saying, oh, I'm buying excess because I know that my load forecasting may not be as good as I might like it otherwise. And so those types of issues are going to come in as well. But what we've tried to do is basically to come up with a way to say, okay, for any given configuration of slices and seasons, can I come up with a metric that sort of says how much variation there is in the requirement that's being set, and how much there is, how much variation is there in that slice for what the maximum values are. And the maximum values, to some degree, are what you're thinking about as being the setting the requirements for a particular hour or for a particular month. There are other calculations, there are other metrics that could be done. We welcome sort of people who come up with other metrics that they think are relevant and can be calculated. There are ways to be thinking about sort of how this works and how this is set up. So next slide, please.
Can we take Noah's question? And I know Scott Olson also had a question on the first slide, if they're quick.
Okay. Quick question, Noah?
Yeah, actually, do you want to let Scott go? I think he was in front of me.
Sure, I'll go quick. Can you guys hear me okay, Greg?
Yep.
Great. So this is Scott Olson with NRG. So I had a question just on using that maximum hour, Peter. Yep. And the impact relative to today's procurement. I know later in your presentation, you have an example showing what procurement would be required under a 2-season approach. So right. For, say, something like hour ending 19, the peak in September is 42 gigawatts, where the peak in June is 29. So if you're doing that max hour approach, there'd be a lot of over procurement for hours like that in the summer. But in theory, LSEs will be procuring less in other slices because you're now matching the shape and you're not just going for the peak. Has there been any analysis just comparing today's procurement for what LSEs are procuring relative to any of these approaches or straw proposals to determine if it's more, if it's less, if there's any significant change in amount or costs?
You know, Scott, that's a really good question. It is something that we've talked about and thought about doing, or at least I've thought about doing. It's not something that we have done to date. But you're right in that right now, if you think about it, the way the procurement is being done on a monthly basis and it's being set by the maximum demand in that month, essentially most of the hours in that month don't need to have near that much capacity available to be able to meet the load. And so there is a certain amount of over procurement that is being done under today's framework. If you're thinking about, oh, what my measure is that I'm hitting the requirement, I'm hitting the requirement right on what I think what I think my load is going to be. And this is where it gets into, well, in the RA program, it's not just to sort of meet your load, it's to be assured that you're going to be able to meet your load. And so you're essentially buying insurance with going to a value that's higher than what you think your load is going to be. And so the real question, certainly in my mind, is, you know, how much insurance are you willing to buy, and how much insurance are you willing to build into essentially the requirements and how the requirements are set? But the short answer to your question is it's not a calculation that we have done. I think it is a calculation that can be done. And essentially we could use that as a basis for, are we going to be doing more or less than what we're doing today?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important, back to your point on cost effectiveness, and one of the key principles that if you're going to a seasonal approach, there always will be some over procurement relative to today during the peak hours, but is that being balanced by how the rest of the structure is? So doing that analysis, I think, will be important to evaluating any. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, it is a balancing. Noah, quick question.
Yeah, Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Hi, Peter. Can you, maybe this is along the same lines as what Scott was asking, but it's a little bit unclear to me with what the variation coefficient does if we're setting the requirements based on sort of the worst hour of each slice.
What it's doing, Noah, is that it's basically looking at it's looking at sort of all of the worst hours and all of the in sort of in that time frame, in that period. How much is that worst hour essentially compared to the other worst hours in that time frame? You know, if I look at the peak demand and say in say September, and I compare that to what the peak demand is in May, and if they're in the same season, then I've got a very big variation in terms of what the requirement could be and how it could be set.
Right, and so would that lead to a sort of an understanding of maybe you don't want to set the requirement at that worst hour because it's such a high variation?
Well, for a particular I mean, what we're doing, Noah, is we're trying to define what the seasons and slices are, so that you can get less variation if you go to a different definition of seasons and slices, or a lower variation of seasons and slices.
I see. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Is that helpful? I mean, what we're trying to do is to have some sort of a metric to say, oh, how much variation is there in this season and slice? Is it desirable or undesirable, or are we okay with it? Is really what we're trying to do.
Got it. And have you seen in your analysis so far whether or not the gross peak load hour versus the net peak load hour, whether or not they are distinctively separate in different slices, or are they generally overlapping in time?
Well, I think I'm going to say I think we know that the net load peak hour essentially generally comes later than the gross peak load hour. And depending upon how you define your slice, they may be in the same slice, or they may not be in the same slice. And it may be desirable or undesirable to have them in the same slice.
Yeah. Okay. I think I looked at some of your 2026 data that you posted in the last slide deck, and it appeared that they primarily overlap a lot rather than have separate distinct hours. So that may be helpful to determine whether or not where the slices need, kind of sit anyways. So thanks for your answers.
Yep. Other clarifying questions? I want to make sure we're clarifying here, because I want to make sure I get through things.
Yep. Kathleen, I think you were next.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I do have 2 clarifying questions. Back on the forecast, actually, first. You mentioned the CAISO hourly, but I just wanted to confirm within the cases, so the forecast, low, mid, high, and the energy efficiency variations on those low, mid, high, are you putting that forward as the mid case as we use today, or have you thought any about using maybe a high demand versus, high mid? I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about the specific cases.
Yeah, well, what we're doing so far at this point is all illustrative. And so we're not proposing any particular case per se that is used. And part of that is because of the fact that all of these things go into essentially setting what the reliability is and how the reliability. If we do, currently the RA requirements are set on a 1 in 2 load forecast. If we push that to a 1 in 5 load forecast, that will change essentially what the requirements are. It'll to a large degree raise the requirements. We are making no recommendation or no judgment about whether that should be a 1 in 2 or a 1 in 5 or a 1 in 10 or a 1 in 20 in terms of what the load forecast is. All we're trying to do is basically and is basically to show that there are relationships between these things, and you need to be thinking about how and what, nailing down all of these different pieces before you essentially decide exactly how the program should work or how the program should be set up. So is that helpful? We're not making a recommendation about any particular load forecast.
I think that is helpful, Peter. The data that you're showing for the forecast, I think what maybe another helpful follow-up is, so if I were to want to look at that CAISO hourly data, I need to go onto the CEC and I have options. So I think my question is less about what you're proposing, and I appreciate that you're not proposing one of these, but I wanted some better context for which of the
ones we're using.
Yes,
and I believe we're using the mid case, but I will let Luke confirm which case we're using from the IPER.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's the mid case.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for confirming that.
Sure.
My second clarifying question is on the net load. I just wanted to clarify, see if you had thought, if we're contemplating removing wind and solar from the net load, does that translate into a logical assumption that the solar and wind that is being accounted for in the net load is guaranteed an RA contract under this proposal?
Well, they are not. They're not guaranteed an RA contract per se. They can be used essentially on a must-take basis to be able to perform, and it'll assume that they will perform at whatever level of exceedance that is assumed that they could perform at.
Why don't we go ahead and maybe do another 2 slices? I see Doug Carpa and Eric Little also have some questions, and I know you want. Let's go ahead and move forward, and then Doug and Eric, you're first in line for like our next mini Q&A. Is that all right? Well, I'll assume it's all right. I'm saying it's all right. So yeah, go ahead, Peter.
And pretty much what we're trying to do with these metrics is just to give some sort of idea of how much variation there is in the slice, given the definition of the season in the slice. And so the coefficient of variation is the standard deviation divided by the mean. It really is only impactful for essentially each of the slices. So that if you look at the sort of what's in the graph there, what we've calculated there is what the variation is in each of the slices in terms of what those maximum values would be. So if you see in that first slice, it's 3%. It means that there's not very much variation essentially within that definition of slice between the hours that are contained in that slice. If you look, however, to the summer in the 2026, starting at hour 22, it's 25%. And that variation is basically probably coming from the fact that we're looking at a lot more months within that slice, and there's a lot more variation across the months. And so that gets at, what sort of seasons do you want to think about, and how do you want to have those seasons? The idea of this metric is really just to give you some sort of, to provide some sort of idea to think about, okay, how much variation are we talking about, what the requirements are going to be within a particular season and slice, and is that desirable or undesirable in terms of the level that might be there. So if we go to the next slide, if we talk about seasons and we think about seasons, seasons, 12 seasons basically are doing things on a monthly basis. That's how we currently do it. I don't think anybody is thinking about doing resource adequacy on anything less than or in a shorter period of time than a month. And so sort of on one end, you've got sort of 12 seasons or monthly doing things on a monthly basis. On the other end, you could do things, if you're looking at an annual requirements or annual showings, you could do essentially one and have one season for the entire month, for the entire year, and have a single requirement set for all hours within the year. That's not the way we do it now. We're used to essentially thinking about things on a monthly basis and thinking about things. So we're doing essentially 12 levels of granularity, or at least 12 as being being the maximum that you might be thinking about what the season lengths could be. And that would correspond to months. And so the metrics, since we're basing it basically sort of on what the maximum value is within that month, let's essentially go to the next slide in terms of giving it an example. So this pretty much shows you sort of within a season. Now we have a season here of June, July, August, September, and October, and this is really just for illustrative purposes. We basically see that in a particular hour, say hour ending 8, they have values in terms of what the maximum requirement is in those, or the maximum value is in that hour in that month. And what we're doing is then we're taking the mean of that to calculate what the variation is across the maximums. And then we're also taking the mean and the standard deviation. And essentially, it's the standard deviation divided by the mean essentially gets you what the variation is. So what you can see here is this 19% variation reflects the fact that you've got 24,000 in October in this month, in this hour requirement, but you would, if you include it with June, it would basically has 14,000. And so essentially you're looking at sort of how big of a difference is there within the definitions of what you're talking about, particularly on the seasonal basis. Hour ending 23, it's a similar sort of thing. You've got 31 gigawatts of the mean. You divide that by there's much less variation in hour ending 23. The idea here is essentially to come up with a way of thinking about how much variation is there within the showing period that we're illustrating. So next slide, please. What we can see here is that we have we're looking at two different setups, and for say for 3 different years, 4 season and a 2 season. And what we're calculating is sort of what the variation is when we're doing a comparison. And notice that in the 2 season that the variation, because we're talking about a longer period of time within the seasons, there's much more variation in what those requirements would be than if it were in a 4 season setup. And the point to some degree is the seasons that you define for the most part will have an impact. With what months you're putting together in a season will have an impact on sort of whether you're hitting that requirement or how closely you're hitting those requirements. So next slide, please. We can also apply this to slices, where essentially where there's sort of 2 metrics there. One is sort of the size of the slice, whether it be 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, and also then when the slice starts, because how you cut up the day could make a difference, and how it and where it can make a difference. And again, since we're looking at this in this basis, on an illustrative basis, let me show you to some degree in the next slide how this might have an impact. If I'm looking at 4-hour slices, and at the top it's on a gross load basis, on the bottom it's on a net load basis, 4-hour slices versus 6-hour slices, essentially there's more variation in the 6-hour slices than there is in the 4-hour slices. This is to be expected. The question is the level of variation the right thing that we should be thinking about when we think about whether or not we're setting the size of the slices. The other thing about this slices is not only sort of what the size is, but also when they start. So if you go to the next slide, please. If we have if we start that at different, if you're doing 4-hour slices and you start it at different hours, you're cutting that load curve at different points in time, and that'll have an impact if you're putting hours together within the slice, essentially that are different hours. So in the top graph, it's basically hour ending 1 that starts the slice, and you can see sort of in the top graph what that implication is. In the bottom graph, you can see that it's hour ending 2. What we've done to some degree, we've done some calculations about what that might look like. We see to some degree that the least amount of variation seems to be when you start to think about things in hour ending 2. And that's when and how we are thinking about essentially coming up with what that definition is. Notice in the top graph, when you change the hour, that the slice 6 essentially has a much higher requirement in the top graph than it does in the bottom graph. And that's because you're putting that 1 hour, instead of it being with the other hours and with the high value, it's basically going with lower valued hours, and it's pulling up the requirement in that slice. And so which hour the slice starts also has an impact on how things are supposed to look. So let me see, next slide. Before I talk about this, before I get into straw proposals, let's see if we can take the quick questions, clarifying questions.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize there need to be clarifying questions at this point. We have some time at the end of the day to go into more detail and back and forth. Eric, you're up. Oh, Doug? No, Doug was up. Doug, go ahead.
Still unmuting. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Doug.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, thanks. This it seems quite interesting. And I guess, have you, maybe I'm stealing your thunder, have you looked at also like how we might look at variation in the width of slices? Like if we have, say, 4-hour slices around peaks, but then 6-hour slices in the middle of the day or overnight, kind of a mix and match scenario. I guess in principle, it would be the same kind of analysis.
Yeah, I'm going to say, and to answer your question, no, we haven't looked at that aspect of it, but in principle, we would think it would be the same sort of analysis. But but it's not something not something we've looked at and done.
Peter, it's Eric. Doug, are you done? I don't want to interrupt if he still has a question.
No, that was it. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, Doug.
Hey, Peter, it's Eric Little from Cal CCA.
Yep.
So, I got a few questions here for you, and some of them were from before and some of them were for these last couple slides.
Yeah.
And if the first one is really a counting issue that we're going to deal with in the next workshop, that's fine. Just let me know. But you've got the potential for ELCC, exceedance, and netting of renewable resources. And those things differ in how they're measured and what they're really doing in that seasonality. Are you looking to try to figure out how to make those mesh with one another, depending upon the season length, et cetera?
Eric, that's a good question, but I think you're getting into resource counting, and let me say that it should be a consideration in how we define what the seasons and slices are. Now, how that's going to play in, we haven't gotten to yet.
Okay. Another couple of quick clarifying questions. The models that you just showed with seasons have 2 or 4. I thought the original proposal had 3. Is the 3 seasons dead?
I guess the way to think about these straw proposals and examples that we're showing is that we're really just trying to be illustrative.
Okay.
We haven't done, and let me be very clear about this, we haven't done an analysis that says this is the way we think it should be done. We're basically laying the options out to be able to get input, to be able to do that balancing that it has been asked by the commission. So,
Okay.
so I wouldn't say it's necessarily dead, but again, we need to be thinking about sort of all of these things when we're putting together the program.
All right, thank you, Peter. And my final question for you is, have you thought at all about how frequently these metrics would be reviewed?
That's a good question. I don't know that we have thought about that, Eric. The idea to some degree is that there are metrics that can be calculated. They might need to be reviewed. I don't know. I mean, it really depends, I think, on sort of what we think how the load is going to develop and how the resources are going to develop as to whether or not we think they're, and to some degree, how much we're building in terms of capacity to meet demand. If we're building in a lot of capacity to meet a lot of capacity, and we're relatively assured we can meet all demand, that probably means that they can be looked at a little less often. If we're trying to be very, very precise about hitting what we think the load forecast is, then I think we need to have to probably look at it on a more frequent basis.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Sure. Alan, I think you're up.
Hi, clarifying question about how you're defining you're terming it variation. You keep saying it's the standard deviation divided by the mean, and I'm just gonna go out on a limb and assume that most people on this call, it's been a while since we've been in stats class, and I'm trying to figure out what your standard deviation is how much each next standard deviation you have to jump up by to get the next
yeah, I mean,
standard deviation.
Yeah, the idea, Alan, is that certainly for people who haven't had stats recently, or for whom it's not ingrained, really what we're trying to do is to have a measure of variation within a group and how that variation is measured. So the groups here are basically the hours, or the hours within the slices and the seasons. And what we're doing is we're comparing sort of how much they vary, and we're coming up with a single number. We do that by looking at calculating what the standard deviation is. The standard deviation essentially is the square root of, basically is the square root of the mean, or I'm sorry, the square root of the variation. And the variation, for the most part, looks at sort of what the difference is, each value is from the mean. And so what we're doing is, and then sort of what is the mean, what is the variation from the mean? We sum that up, we calculate that for each observation, you sum that up, that gives you the variance. You take the square root of the variance essentially to get the standard deviation. We're then comparing that standard deviation to what the mean actually was. And that's sort of what that ratio is. It's sort of, oh, we're looking at the differences from the mean, and we're looking at the differences from the mean in a systematic way that comes up with one number for the entire group.
Okay, and so then is the idea to come up with a number for that group and then compare it versus other groups so that you have like a common. Okay.
Okay. It's basically to come up with how much variation do I have in this definition of season slice? If I have a lot, that means something, that there's a lot of difference between the hours in that season slice. Maybe I want to have less variation within that season slice, or maybe I want to have more. what is it? I mean, it's really just a metric to be able to try and measure how much variation there is.
All right. I'll try and noodle on that a little bit more. Thank you.
Chris.
Hi, Peter. Chris Devon, Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, quick question for you. Have you thought about any other metrics other than this variation metric?
Yes.
Could you describe them high level?
You know, you could think about, to some degree, trying to look at sort of, oh, how much procurement am I going to have to do in particular hours when I don't need it, essentially to meet the peak. And so there you know, you could do a calculation to some degree of how much excess capacity do I have to carry to be able to do that. Now, to some degree, that's a little bit of you know, and what is the cost of that? What is the cost of that if I am looking at a standard cost for capacity? So those types of metrics we've thought about. Those types of metrics are things that would be able to, you know, it's a hard metric because you have to then think about this in a way that it's not just the variation that you care about. It's also, oh, what if I basically do a 1 and 2 forecast and I hit it on 1 and 2, and I set the requirement for that season slice right on that 1 and 2 forecast. Well, if I'm doing a 1 and 2 load forecast, I'm probably going to be wrong half of the time, and the values are going to be higher half of the time. Oh, oops. I'm setting a requirement based on a mean, on a 1 and 2 sort of mean, but half of the values are going to be above that. Do I really want to do that? Do I really, you know, how much insurance do I want to have built into the system? And so there are other metrics that could be used. It's not clear that there's a standard universal metric that could be used that could get a handle on that. We're really just trying to give a metric that can compare various proposals against each other.
Okay, that's helpful. I think you do need to compare those, and I'll just make one quick opinion here is just that, you know, I think we should maybe think about adding some other things, you know, including some kind of cost associated, like you mentioned in here as well, trying to slice and dice the day, because I do worry that if we just focus only on the variance, we lose out on some of the other qualitative things, like having extra cushion for allowing planned outages and other things that we might want to bring into the discussion. And I'll stop there just for the sake of time. Thank you.
No, and Chris, that's a good point. This is not meant to be a single and only metric. This is meant to be this is meant to be a metric to show to some degree what one way to measure that is. There are a lot of other considerations that need to be taken into account, and we need to talk about them and how important they are.
Yeah, very good. I do think that it's a good starting point. So thanks for the you know, initial thoughts here, Peter.
Sure. Doug, question.
I think he just left his hand up.
Oh, he left his hand up. Okay.
That was an accident. Sorry.
Okay. So Jamie, question.
Hi, Peter. Yeah, I've got kind of two fairly simple questions, I hope. So I guess I'm trying to kind of understand the, you know, the variance goal, and I'm hearing that it's, you know, just a metric to kind of inform or compare against other metrics. But I mean, is the goal to minimize the, you know, the variance between or in the seasons? If you did this exercise in various, you know, different iterations of it, are you looking for a minimum across setting the season and slice? And then I guess I'll pause there and let you answer that one.
And the answer to that is, Jamie, is no, we're not necessarily looking for a minimum. What we're looking for, because what the commission has asked us for is to balance essentially the cost of procurement with essentially the reliability. And so what we're trying to do is to say, oh, do I have a way of looking at the way I'm putting the requirement together that might be able to inform both the cost of procurement, because I may be over procuring in a lot of hours on the one hand, but that over procurement in a lot of hours may be buying me a whole lot of reliability. And so the thought for the most part is that this is not, the objective is not to minimize the variance because there are other aspects that have to fit into the RA program that have to do this balancing that the commission has asked for.
Okay, so I keep thinking PRM.
Yep.
And so, I want to kind of bridge maybe, how are you thinking about this variance metric in terms of the PRM? And I mean, would we be thinking, I guess, in setting the slices and, determining how much variance there is across the season, does that trigger a need to kind of think about the PRM across seasons and slices and that determination there?
Absolutely. All of these things from our perspective, these things need to all be thought about and determined together. And so it's what the definition of seasons are, what the definition of slices are in terms of what they are, what the counting rules are essentially for resources, including wind and solar, what the load forecast is. Are we relying on a 1 in 2, a 1 in 5, a 1 in 10? All of those things essentially go into essentially setting a level of what the expected reliability is, as reflected in a loss of load expectation study. And so the way we define things and the way we define a particular season and slices will have an impact to some degree as to what the other parameters are for us to be able to get to the loss of load expectation, or the LOLE, on the system that is desired. And
once, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, so once the seasons are kind of determined, seasons and slices, would we have to do LOLE studies on each of those?
You would have to do, and I think the answer, Jamie, is yes. You would have to make sure, and I guess what I'm suggesting is that there should be a feedback loop there. We should be basically looking to sort of see, okay, under this definition of, what resources are we requiring? What level of LOLE does that produce? Oh, is that too high of a LOLE? Is it too low of an LOLE? How can we adjust essentially either what the definitions are of the seasons and slices, or what the counting rules are, or what the load forecast is, to be able essentially to adjust to be able to get to that target level of reliability.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, let's see. I only have a short time left, don't I? Let me go into the seasons. What we've done here is basically to look at 2 straw proposals and sort of apply the metric to the 2 straw proposals is what we're trying to do here. So if we combine the season and slices, we can see that. So option 1 is basically based on a net load and 2 seasons with 4-hour slices. The seasons basically being June through October and November through May. What we're doing essentially is by having 6 slices per season and only 2 seasons, essentially there are only 12 values that are being procured to be able to set the reliability for the entire year. And what we're trying to do here is to show that there's a trade-off between essentially the number of seasons and slices and how often you have to do the showing and what the procurement level is. So if we look here, if we look at this straw proposal, we have, again, hour ending 2 starts the winter. The requirements, which are basically then set at the dotted lines, the black dotted lines in both the winter and the summer. We can then essentially, under this definition, essentially go and calculate what the variants are within each of these seasons and slices. So if we go to the next slide, what we're doing here is, what this shows is sort of what the requirement is, and the requirement for this definition, which is basically these seasons, these 2 seasons and slices. Actually, this is just for the summer seasons. What the mean is of what the requirements are, and that's this 23,572 is the mean of all of the values in that hour ending 2 to hour ending 5 for June, July, August, September, and October. That's what the mean is. The standard deviation of those values is 1.45, or I'm sorry, 1,145. The variation is 5%. So it's what the variance is. It's a relatively tight variance. We're talking about overnight period. Load doesn't vary very much. We see what the maximum value is. And so what the mean is if we were setting the requirement based on the mean in those, it would be 23,572. By setting it on the maximum, or setting the maximum to some degree, it's at 25,700. So you could say on average, essentially, we're procuring more than essentially 2,000 megawatts or 2,200 megawatts, essentially more than is what is needed on average. Now, that might be okay because essentially what you're trying to do is to make sure that you meet the maximum in that, and that you don't have periods of time when you expect essentially for procurement to be lower than that. So what this illustration shows to some degree is sort of what each of the slices are, what the means are, what the maximum is that set the requirement, and the variations. And the variations, for the most part, under this definition, you can see that they're relatively high, sort of in the middle of the day. If we go to the next slide basically looks at another option, which is basically, again, option 2, which is a net load, which is 4 seasons and 4 hourly slices. And essentially what we've got here in the graphs are basically what the requirements are being set at and how they're being set for the most part, and looking at the load plus a planning reserve margin and setting the requirements. And we're assuming a certain level of planning reserve margin, which again, we'll probably have to adjust when we think about sort of what the right, where we're picking up the uncertainty. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see what the variation is in each of those periods. We haven't sort of set the requirements. The requirements are pretty much in the bolded values for each of the seasons in terms of what is setting the requirement. But the variation there is, again, you can see that there's lower variation in some of these hours. There's greater variation in other hours. And this is really just as a metric to be able to see that and to have some sort of idea. Now, this configuration essentially has 24 showings rather than 12 showings. The previous configuration, which was basically 2 seasons and 6 slices, basically had only 12 showings. This has 24 showings, so that each LSC has to show essentially 24 values to the PUC to be able to meet their RA requirement, and how those are defined are set up by the seasons and slices. Let's go to the next slide. I think we're okay. And so the straw proposals are really just as an illustration for sort of how the metrics can work to be able to provide some information about how much variation there is in here. I'm going to talk a little bit about resource counting, because resource counting matters, particularly if you're thinking about, if we're thinking about you doing things on a net load basis, because the net load, it depends upon so much how much credit are we going to be giving the wind and the solar in terms of what they can count for, how much we're going to be able to rely on them in each hour. And you can see here between the two graphs, the graph on the left essentially is, again, we're looking at the 2019 CEC forecast, and we're looking to some degree about different levels of exceedance. On the left, we're crediting a 50% exceedance. On the right, we're crediting a 75% exceedance. And you can see that the net loads are much higher on the right side when we go to a higher level of exceedance, because essentially we're not giving as much credit to the wind and the solar under that level of exceedance as we do on the left graph, which essentially is a 50% level of exceedance. So there is this interplay, as I was trying to explain to Jamie, there is this interplay between sort of how much credit we're giving to resources, as well as sort of what the requirements are in terms of how much they can count for the requirements, or how to set the requirements if you're basing it on that load, and essentially then the level of reliability that will result from that. And from our perspective, from PG&E's perspective, we need to keep all of these things in mind when we're thinking about sort of what is the right combination of system of seasons, slices, exceedance values for counting, whether we're doing on a gross load basis or a net load basis. All of these things have an impact on sort of and what the planning reserve margin is. You know, how you're setting the planning reserve margin. Also, all of these things are things that need to be considered together, because we want to make sure that we have a metric for level of reliability, and that metric from PG&E's perspective is the loss of load expectation, or the LOLE, and it's that kind of study that needs to be done to be able to make sure that we've got the right configuration of these things to hit that level of reliability. So with that, let me go to the next slide. I think we've had a little bit of discussion, sort of what are, you know, I don't know how much time I have for discussion. I got to think of what how much time do I have, Greg? Am I to 11:30?
No, you have about 10 minutes left, Peter.
Okay. Well, let me open it up then for discussion in terms of the types of inputs that we're looking for, the way we're thinking about this. The straw proposals really, as we put them forward, were designed just to show some of this trade-off and the balance that is needed. And sort of the things that we need input on, or we need to, in the discussion, is to how important do we think these things are in terms of things like the timing and number of showings. You know, we've shown a two-season that basically has the same number of showings. Now those showings are going to be different because instead of doing it once every month, you're basically going to be doing it twice a year, once every 6 months, but you're going to, for each showing, you're going to have to do essentially show 6 slices. So those types of things matter, and we need to probably get some input as to what the thinking is and how people think about that in terms of what is how much trouble is that, how hard is it going to be to transact for these types of things in terms of getting capacity, and sort of also what are the procurement costs of buying and how much we're buying. So let me open it there for a little bit of discussion and questions from people.
Hey, Peter. So this is Greg Klatt. We have a couple questions in the chat.
Okay.
Before we do that, just a thought I had while we were giving your presentation. Would it make sense to make, I guess, the work papers that were developed for this?
Yes. No, thank you, Greg, for breaking that up, because certainly PG&E has put together a spreadsheet model that we have shared with some parties, and we're willing to share it with any party who wants to basically who wants to play with the data and look at it and do things with it. We are willing to share that with any participant who would like to contact us, and we can send it to you, give you a little bit of instruction as to how to use it and how to look at it and how to think about it. It would be particularly helpful for people to, instead of just looking at these presentations, to get their hands dirty a little bit with the data and play with the data a little bit, to be able to, and to use the same sort of data that everybody else is using, so that we can facilitate some discussion and some thoughts about that. So yes, Greg, we are willing to make this available, and that is something I did want to highlight, is that we will make available the spreadsheet that we've used to essentially create all of the graphs and things that you've seen.
Yeah, I think that would be great. We can kind of crowd source this, right?
Yep.
More folks looking at different variations and not having to reinvent the spreadsheet. That's great.
Yes.
So I think that goes to Noah's question. He says, have you looked at the variation if you set the summer season to be May through October? So I know it's not in your presentation, so just
the answer to that is no, but we are happy to have you look at it if you want to look at it and to see how much variation there is.
Yeah, we could expect more variation, right?
Yes. Yeah, we would expect there to be more variation, largely because May is very, very different than October and September.
And then Paul Warhack his question was, does this analysis include storage charging requirements?
The analysis, for the most part, what we're trying to do, and the short answer to that is no. The storage charging requirements are pretty much dependent upon sort of how much storage comes to the system, how much energy the storage is bringing with it, and how much energy is going to be needed from that. This analysis does not take into sort of the quantity of storage that will essentially bump up the requirements per the way we've talked about it. And the way we've talked about it in the resource counting for the most part is the storage can count for a particular slice or slices. They have to point to periods of time when they're bringing capacity essentially to be able to do that charging.
Mm-hmm.
This analysis does not include that. And that would have to be included for the most part in the way that the requirements would be set or the requirements be met.
Yeah, it'll definitely have to be addressed, right?
Yeah.
And then Nick Papas question, either for now or discussion section later in the day, when thinking of metrics, have you considered how to weigh over procurement in some hour slices versus other? For example, if we expect LLCs to show 30 gigawatts of 24/7 dispatchable non-limited resources, do we care about over procurement below 30 gigawatts? He says, making an assumption that these resources have similar fixed costs, whether shown for one slice or 24. That seems to be getting into enough detail. We may want to defer that to.
Yeah, I think we can defer that. I mean, I think that's a topic we can probably try and discuss at 2 o'clock when we're trying to get to the discussion matters closer to the end of the day. So I would like to defer that if possible.
And then we have, I'm not sure what order this came up in, so if I'm going out of order, I apologize to the folks with questions, but it looks like Eric, Doug, and Chris in that order.
Yeah.
Hey, Peter, Eric Little from Cal CCA. So I didn't get the impression that this was necessarily questions, but discussion. So you asked the question about need input from parties on the greatest pain point.
Yep.
I kind of see this as effective and efficient, right? So effective is, does it meet the reliability needs, which is why you've set it to the worst scenarios. And then efficient really gets to all three of the things that are here. So if I was to break this down within that set of efficient, I think the biggest one is procurement costs, because those can be significant. You know, you had quite a variation there in if you went to kind of a monthly type of a measure versus the seasonal type of measure, you had upwards of 6 or 7 gigawatts of difference in procurement in there as far as I could see. So I think that would top my list. And then behind that is probably the transactions. You know, how am I going to be able to transact this product? But honestly, that one really comes down to resource counting and what it's able to sell more than the discussion that we've had today. The number and timing of showings, I think that one we need to think about how you can effectively and efficiently evaluate RA showings, because it'll be different than it is today. Don't know if it'll be better or worse. But we need to kind of think those things through. So if I had to order it, I would put it in the reverse order of the way that your bullet points appear in terms of importance from my viewpoint.
Okay, Eric, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for that input.
Doug.
Yeah, so if I understand, I guess I got a little bit of mixed messages here, but I would think that having gone through the process of calculating the coefficient of variation for different slices and season combinations, that we would really want to use that as the metric by which for which we choose which slices and how many seasons we're going to use. I think that I'm stumbling a little bit on the notion that we would do all that and then not actually have that be the basis on which we determine the various slices. So is that the intent, that we would calculate all that, but it's just sort of informative, but doesn't really, we still have to decide what we're going to do after that? Or is there some other metric that you're looking to use as the to determine which set of slices and which set of seasons we use?
Yeah, no, Doug, it's a good question. I mean, given the fact that the commission has given us balance these things, really, and it has given us basically about half a dozen things we need to balance. Having a single metric to be able to have an indication I don't think there's a perfect metric for which we can essentially optimize for. Let me put it that way. I think part of that gets at sort of, what are the things that are important? What are the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of setting this? Going to the issue of, the issue of sort of setting up what the metric is and how the metric works, I think it is helpful. I think to some degree it doesn't get at some of the things that Eric just talked about, which are sort of what the procurement costs are, what the transaction costs are, and those types of things, which I think are also very important considerations. So it's, is there a perfect metric to be able to set up? I'd like to think that there might be from a theoretical standpoint. I think from a practical standpoint, I think we're all going to have to rely on whatever analysis we can do and whatever we think is the right way to move forward. So I don't know if that answers your question, or
it does a little bit. And I guess from my standpoint, I worry a little bit about methodologies that we calculate a bunch of things, and then we have this sort of after the fact, kind of mighta, sort of shoulda, like we're gonna somebody in some room is gonna kind of ad hoc, basically without any real process or guidelines, like decide on like which of these is the best. That's not a very solid methodology. And so I would I guess encourage some hard thinking among the stakeholders of what are we trying to optimize here? Because it is ultimately an optimization process. And I do think that like we might, one technical comment is, rather than taking means of the coefficient of variation across slices, I think what you're really doing, needing to do, is to maximize the explained variance across the whole set of, what essentially each slice is a prediction, and then there's that has a variance.
Doug, I'm gonna have to cut you off. Doug, I'm gonna have to cut you off. Sorry.
Because I think if you weight that by cost of that, if not all variances are the same, you get a lot closer to a cost optimization models, which I think is where we have to go.
So
I'm sorry to go a little bit there, but
no, we're past time. Apologies to Chris, Hillary, Grant, and also Mary. You had a question in the chat. We'll try to get back to this at the end of the day. We do have to make time for Kathleen's presentation for Vistra. So why don't we go ahead and do the handoff now? Peter, I don't know, any closing kind of remarks?
No, just thanks everybody. We can bring up this topic and talk about it at the end of the day. We have an hour set aside at the end of the day, and I think this is an appropriate topic for that.
Yep. All right, Kathleen, it's all you now, and we're going to go, if we need to, 4 minutes after 12 o'clock to make sure you have the full time.
Great. I'm just going to figure out how to share my screen. Start there.
It's at the top right next to leave. So share, it looks like like an upload icon.
Got it. Can you confirm that you can see my my presentation? Can someone confirm that?
Yes, we got it.
Okay, great. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present at the workshop today. I appreciate the chance to provide some perspectives from Vistra. Just for some background, I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Vistra. We are a Fortune 275 integrated retail electricity provider and competitive power provider. Within California, we have over 1,500 megawatts of capacity that do provide RA to the state of California under the CPUC's LRA. With that context in mind, we wanted to provide some of our perspectives, and I actually did not raise my hand, but I will answer Peter's question about what is our pain point, or what are the pain points we want to raise when we think about a healthy RA, a well-functioning RA program, a healthy RA program. The reason that we wanted to present today was because we do have some priorities. And I think the pain points specifically are things need to be commercially viable, things need to be transactable, and we need to have confidence in what we're transacting to. So with that context in mind, I will move on. I'm going to touch on Vistra's principles for well-functioning RA market, go in a little bit more detail. The second, I want to move from those principles and dive into, so there are specific principles that we hold that relate directly to in our opinion, to what the CPUC's principles were in their directive, and highlight how commercial procurement reality should be factored in while we're discussing what the eventual proposals might look like. The third item is I'd like to go into what the RA reform changes related to planning standards and requirements, kind of more of the high-level structural conversation, also aligned with those principles. Starting with Vistra's principles that to support a well-functioning market. As I mentioned, we're a competitive power provider. We believe that these items should be present in any well-functioning RA program in California. We should be maintaining consistency between the CPUC's processes and the CAISO's processes. CPUC, I think IRP, RA, CAISO, I'm thinking it's RA administration and its capacity procurement mechanism. The second goal or principle that should be achieved is that the RA market should be able to support reliability and state environmental goals. We agree with that, believe in that. The third is that the RA program should promote efficient entry and exit of resources. Fourth, it should establish system requirements based on a 1 in 10 planning standard set by loss of load expectation study, capturing uncertainty factors. And we'll go in more detail on that in the third section. The next is that we should be valuing use limited and on-demand resources based on their capability. Next is that we should be requiring resources to be available all days it is physically capable. Next is that we need to recognize commercial procurement realities, and we'll talk about that in more detail in the next section. And then finally, we need to be respecting existing contracts. With that in mind, I'm going to transition to dive into a little bit more detail on some specific principles. The first one that I mentioned, maintaining consistency across the CPUC and CAISO processes. Also, the current RA construct is go into a little bit of that, respecting commercial reality, and then finally the valuation of the resources. So first, providing more context on Vistra's perspectives on when we say maintaining consistency across processes. We think that any design needs to be able to support forward planning on behalf of market participants. It should also be supporting a more cost-effective market outcome by reducing regulatory uncertainty, complexity, and administrative burdens. On the next main principle that we have, we want to emphasize that we think the current RA construct is transactable. If we move the design in a new direction, we need to respect the current commercial reality as much as possible to not disrupt that transactability. Sub-principles under that is that the RA program should be recognize commercial reality that RA products are largely bundled. Second is that to recognize commercial reality that the central procurement entity awards are currently awarding, at least for the one that I'm most familiar with, PG&E's CPE, multi-year bundled product. It is system, local, and any applicable flex, and that is, so under today's construct, we are competing for multi-year bundled products today already. And the third is that we should be respecting existing contracts. The third main principle that feeds into this category is that the current RA construct does not we recognize and agree with what all other parties and the CPUC identified in the first phase, is that the current RA construct does not accurately capture the value of use limited and on-demand resources based on their capability, and a new direction should be adopted. We think that resource capacity valuation should be tied to their ability to show up when needed and to carry load through the risks of loss of load. We also believe that capacity evaluation of resources not available all days of the month should be effectively derated. To support and provide some more context for why we're sharing this information is that we want to share some of our perspectives based on our commercial experience. First, let's talk a little bit about PG&E Central Procurement Entity. And I'm using PG&E because they're the one I'm most familiar with. Happy to put a placeholder and talk about the other SCECP at a later point. Largely our point to bring this up is we need to make sure that within these workshops, we're saving space to have the difficult conversations about when we make a decision, how it impacts and has ripple effects across the other elements of the RA program. I'm raising the CPE because, as I mentioned, multi-year local RA, it has been implemented such that the competitive solicitation is for bundled products that include all the attributes of that RA, system, local, and any applicable flex. For example, a megawatt of bundled RA sold into PG&E CPE sells system, local, any applicable flex associated with that megawatt. The reality is that there is now multi-year system and multi-year flex resource capacity being procured by the CPE up to that local resource adequacy requirement. And one of our asks for the broader community here is let's recognize that reality as we're working on these complex issues. Our second commercial experience comes we'll pivot from the CPE and talk a little bit about bilateral resource adequacy markets. Regardless of whether we enter into a bundled RA product, like I mentioned under CPE, a local RA contract or a system RA contract, there is a reality that our obligation is the same. In practice, our resource adequacy performance for system contracts results in a generic RA obligation. And I think it goes without saying, but I'll say our RA performance for local contracts results in a generic RA obligation. A supplier, another important detail is that a supplier cannot establish more generic RA, system plus local, than its net qualifying capacity. The contract megawatts, when shown, meet both the local and system needs when the CAISO is looking at the ability of the system to support both local requirements and system requirements. Delving in a little bit more detail and providing an example, I'm going to go through what we believe and understand to be facts of the current construct that we should be keeping in mind as we're discussing any of the any movement away from this or refinements to it. First, the resource capacity value is set by the resource's net qualifying capacity. As I just mentioned, that NQC is the limit to the total system and local that can be sold. It is the maximum resource adequacy capacity that can be sold for generic, which includes both. CAISO uses the net qualifying capacity as an input to calculating its effective flexible capacity as well. I note that just to emphasize that NQC changes filter down into impacting EFC under the current rules. CAISO sets next, we want to make sure that we level set that CAISO sets generic resource adequacy as the sum of system and local megawatts. And again, that is limited. It cannot exceed the net qualifying capacity. Next item that we want to make sure we're all level set on is that CAISO sets the flex RA as the amount of flex megawatts shown, which cannot exceed the effective flexible capacity. Below, I'm showing an example. This resource it has a net qualifying capacity of 300 megawatts, an effective flexible capacity of 250, and that's because its Pmin is 50, so the amount that is associated with a flexible dispatch is the 250 megawatts above that minimum operating level. You'll see the minimum, I'm showing the minimum operating level in green, so that's its Pmin. Under this scenario that we're using to illustrate, I'm assuming that we've sold 150 megawatts under a local contract. So the Pmin is associated with a local contract. The additional 100 above that is associated with a local contract, and it contributes to setting a generic RA obligation. The portion of the resources capacity from 150 to 300 has been sold under a system contract for the remaining 150 megawatts of this resource's net qualifying capacity. Again, to illustrate, that system contract contributes to a generic RA obligation. And together, once we show this resource into the CAISO's monthly showings, this results in a 300 megawatt CAISO generic RA obligation. For all intents and purposes at this point, whether or not it was a local contract or a system contract is irrelevant to what our obligation is. It's also irrelevant to what our RAIM penalty is that we're assessed for non-performance and non-availability. Those are assessed at a generic level. It's also critical that what is the combination of system and local cannot exceed the net qualifying capacity because it is the maximum RA capacity. So Vistra is just asking the community as we go through this process to make sure that we keep this in mind, that when we talk about system, when we're talking about county rules under this proceeding, they're going to impact the local, it's going to impact flex, but we should be diligent to continue to talk about the counting at the net qualifying capacity level so that it is a more seamless transition.
Hey, Kathleen,
Yeah.
Really quick, this seems like a good point.
Sure.
The way that your screen is showing, you're blocking the part of your slides. You maybe try turning off your camera. I'm not sure why that happened because I'm not a.
Sure, yeah, give me 1 second.
Yeah. Turn off your camera. Yeah, there you go.
Does that work? Okay.
Yep. Now we can see the whole slide.
No, thank you. And thank you for pointing it out. I appreciate it. Is there, Greg, with that, was there anything that is on the prior slides? I think I largely talked to it. So if there's something was blocked, it should be fine. Is there anything that I should revisit? Okay.
Yeah, it was this slide in particular that I thought it's good to see the bottom right corner there. So.
No, thank you. Appreciate it. I also think, because I'm going to transition from here to the CPE, I think this would also be a good moment to ask for any clarifying questions.
Doug, did you have a question? Doug Carpa.
No, I left my hand up accidentally. Sorry.
That's okay. I can't actually see the questions. So if you don't see any others, I'll move on.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good. Excellent. So the next element that I wanted to go in a little bit more detail is the central procurement entity. So we've kind of put forward, we need to be careful and diligent to keep in mind that counting should be applied to the net qualifying capacity level. Another item that we believe we need to be diligent to ensure is that we're thinking about how anything we discuss here is going to impact the central procurement entity. The adopted framework should describe how the central procurement entity's multi-year procurement for this bundled product, which includes system, interacts with the system resource adequacy requirements that we're discussing here. For example, if the central procurement entity awards bundled RA contracts, that it will meet a portion of the system requirements as well as the local requirements. So a question that we're putting forward for the group, and want to make sure we keep thinking about as we go through this, not just at today's workshop, but every future workshop, is how should the process for system RA requirements that we're evaluating here take into consideration that the CPE is procuring forward multi-year system so that we ensure that we are not over contracting and increasing cost in a way that would not be reasonable. And just emphasizing, Vistra's view is that local requirements should be a subset of system requirements. Understand that we arrive to those requirements in different manners, but that conceptually, if we have let's say we have a 50,000 megawatt system requirement, and let's say that the local, just for example, in illustrating my point, is 20,000, we don't believe that LSE should be going out and procuring 70,000 megawatts. They should be procuring 50,000, upon which 20,000 are located in the local areas. And that's just a core principle that we believe we want to make sure that we think it furthers the CPUC's directives to balance costs against reliability, and that want to be diligent that anything that is discussed or explored here takes into consideration that the system RA requirements are partially being already procured in advance in forward timeframes through the CPE, That should potentially maybe reduce system RA procurement needs for the upcoming year if it's already been procured forward, and that the local should not be considered as unbundled. It is today bundled, and that it shouldn't be unnecessarily increasing our overall procurement by looking at the system requirements that we're discussing here in a silo. My second thing that I wanted to raise for the group is that, as I mentioned, the PG&E CP is procuring megawatts with system local and any applicable flex. So it's prudent for us to explore that these potential counting rules that would still establish a single net qualifying capacity value by month for each resource. This will not only support transactability, and I also mentioned commercial viability, I'm going to throw that out there, but transactability, commercial viability within the central procurement entity, competitive solicitations, because as I mentioned, it's procuring bundled systems. So any changes here to system, we would expect to see a ripple effect on what is being procured in that process, since it's including the system attribute. But we also believe it will better support transactability in the bilateral markets for the system purposes above that local resource adequacy requirement up to the system requirement if we retain a net qualifying capacity structure that can be compatible across these different forums or venues for procurement. Finally, even without a multi-year system resource requirement, we suggest that it's prudent for the CPUC to require system RA requirement study that would provide system RA requirements for each year provided in the local RA requirement studies. This could provide greater transparency on how the system and local RA requirements interact across this multi-year forward period. And while we're not, again, I'll emphasize, not suggesting a multi-year system requirement for procurement purposes at this point, but do think that this information would help feed any future discussion on that point. Any clarifying questions at this point?
Let me check.
Thank you.
No, we're good.
Okay, excellent. Before I move on to the next one, I just say we really appreciate the stakeholder community hearing our perspectives and taking these things into consideration as we continue to look into solutions in this in these workshops. The next item that I want to move to is planning standards and requirements. So the two principles we brought up: maintaining consistency across the CPUC and CAISO. It's a big deal for us. I'm going to keep saying it. The second one is that we should be establishing system requirements based on a 1-day and 10-year planning standard, capturing relevant uncertainty factors. What do we mean by this? We think that we should be balancing grid reliability and consumer costs. To balance those, some amount of risk must be accepted. However, we do think the current level is too high. Next, a probabilistically determined planning reserve margin through a loss of load expectation study set to achieve the 1 in 10 standard, adopted and revisited, that's critical, revisited regularly as system conditions change, will better support reliability. Finally, this loss of load expectation study can further the CPUC's principle that this framework should address hourly energy sufficiency while balancing consumer costs. First of all, it could determine hours of risks. Within that LOLE study could identify the loss of load probability hourly, and then it could also calculate the risk of shortfalls for those hours, probabilistically determined expected unserved energy that factors in certain uncertainties or risk factors. Going in a little bit more detail, our belief, and we've been trying to put this idea forward and wanted to share it with the group, is that we think it would be advantageous for the RA proceeding in track 3B2 to adopt a framework that maintains consistency in planning standards and requirements across the CAISO and CPUC processes. The CPUC could require a planning reserve margin to be determined by specified approach, would specify probabilistically determined loss of load expectation study as the method for determining that, specify that the recent CEC's IPER forecast, regardless if it's full or update, should be used as the basis for the recurring study. Similarly to PG&E, we don't have a suggestion right now on mid-mid versus high-mid or specifically which case, still exploring that perspective. That's why I was curious about those thoughts. The next is that the CPUC would define the planning reliability standard, the reliability threshold that the LOLE study would have to meet. We suggest that is a 1 day in 10 year. And it would also require that certain risk factors or uncertainty factors be looked at under that probabilistically determined expected unserved energy. The ones that jump to mind for us is load forecast, resource availability, uncertainty associated with planned outages without substitution. I heard Chris mention that, and I appreciate that. I will re-emphasize we view this as a substitution risk more so than we do an outage risk. And I want to throw that out there to clarify why we see these as meaningfully different. There's also the uncertainty associated with risk of forced outages. And as I mentioned, we kind of see them as substitution risk versus forced outage risk. This PRM needs to be updated depending on whether, and I just want to emphasize this, that depending on what we land on or for the capacity valuation proposal, the PRM will need to be updated to either include those outages unavailability directly or not, depending on if the resource counting includes them directly or not. There is a give and take there, and we'll need to remember to revisit that. Next, we think this framework, under it, the CPUC could delegate to CAISO responsibility for performing the loss of load expectations study to set the PRM based on those CPUC identified and requirements for determining the planning reserve margin. And then the CAISO would be able to could file those similarly to how it does the local requirements and the flex requirements with the CPUC. So the CPUC and other parties can vet those. And depending on the CPUC's determination, in this case, I'm assuming the CPUC approves those requirements for use in RA procurement. I do want to go over what we see as the benefits of the shared responsibility approach before opening it up. This chart really just shows what I just summarized, and I'm going to go through some of the benefits. First, we think that requiring annual filings ensures that the PRM and resulting system requirements reflect current need, and this will increase market confidence overall and be a huge benefit. We think that also that this shared responsibility approach increases market certainty, that the CPUC and CAISO share the same view of the need, which better supports forward procurement by reducing regulatory risk. And while I didn't note this, I think on an earlier slide I did, it not only supports forward procurement, but a part of what it supports is ensuring that the costs are minimized because it mitigates some of these risks. Another meaningful benefit is that this uses an understood loss of load expectation, expected unserved energy metric that addresses the hourly energy sufficiency while also balancing the complexity and consequently balancing costs. Which is one of the CPUC's directives. In this process, kind of focusing on this, the CAISO performing the probabilistically determined LOLE, this is also a benefit here because it can leverage the CAISO's resource adequacy enhancements phase 2 proposal for the CAISO to determine a minimum system requirement. That's already a proposal the CAISO has put out there. The change that we're suggesting that would be a better collaboration or coordination is that a change where the CAISO must use the CPUC's required inputs for forecast and planning standard that we put forward in the last slide. Moving on to CAISO considering uncertainty factors. Benefit here is that by allowing and delegating the responsibility for performing the loss of load expectation study and requiring certain factors to be evaluated for risk, this provides CAISO the flexibility to incorporate those uncertainty risks in a way that they can ensure that it supports overall reliability. This increases the CAISO's confidence in the results, another benefit. Under this framework, CAISO would file the loss of load expectation results and proposed requirements at the CPUC. This ensures that benefit here is and ensures that the CPUC and RA parties have input into the CAISO proposed requirements. Next, the CPUC approves, but we assume approves the CAISO proposed requirements. The benefit here is that the CPUC is the final decision maker on those requirements, vetting that they meet the CPUC standards. Those are just a few of the benefits that we could think of, and I'm sure there are others that others could identify. And we appreciate the opportunity to present this framework and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kathleen. We have a question from Bridget Sparks at the CAISO.
Sure.
Thanks, Kathleen, for this presentation. A few thoughts and a few questions. So first off, we agree with you that it's important to keep in mind that local and flex can't necessarily be thought of separately from system RA. So I know in the last workshop, Peter mentioned that, you know, he viewed this as us trying to come up with a new system RA requirement. And I think you rightly pointed out that things like NQC values trickle down. And so we can't necessarily think of these as completely separate. So I do think it'll be good in the resource counting workshops to think about what does NQC mean under this proposal, and how do we sort of minimize its impacts on the downstream systems. Next, wanted to sort of ask a couple questions about the slides you have up now in terms of running an LLE model to determine PRM. You know, I think the CAISO is definitely supportive of a process like this, and we agree that, you know, a regular updating of the PRM to maintain reliability standards is important. I think we may have some difficulties doing it in the way that you have it structured, and so I was wondering if, you know, why the CAISO necessarily has to be the ones to run the LLE study, and whether or not this could just be a CPUC run thing. So my first question is, were you imagining that in this LLE study that the CAISO would be looking at its entire footprint and not just CPUC jurisdictional entities?
No, Bridget, that's a great question. I do think that my understanding of the current proposal, and feel free to clarify, but my understanding of the current state of your minimum system requirement proposal is to look at the entire footprint, but with a but within that, you were still looking at individual LR and allocating that down to an LRA level, and so it wasn't completely disconnected from the LRA level. Is that correct?
So we have sort of walked back from this minimum system requirement. So it's no longer in scope under our enhancements at the moment. But I think, yeah, when we were initially discussing it, we had imagined setting a minimum standard across all LRAs, so everyone would have to be procuring up to the same PRM as an adder onto their requirements. So, because my concern is, so the modeling software that the CAISO has access to is Plexos, and the CPUC uses Severum, which is also what's used for the IRP. And so I think our concern is if the CAISO is delegated this responsibility, we could start seeing more discrepancies between what the IRP was planning for versus what the CAISO LLE studies may be indicating, just based on sort of the different models. And so in the past, our modeling teams have had difficulties chewing up the assumptions and inputs between the two modeling tools. And so that may be one reason why we may just want the CPUC to run this on their side. So this is all to say that I think the CAISO is definitely supportive of this idea. We just may not be the right entity to perform this, but would be happy to, you know, collaborate on making sure the inputs and the assumptions work for us so that we're comfortable with the results that come out of this. But I also agree that a regular process is important, and this might be an opportunity to start developing that.
Bridget, I really appreciate all of your comments. My only response that I give at this time is this is a largely just a framework for a shared responsibility approach. I think there's lots of things that could be toggled back. If one of the asks that we were going to give if you jumped in was just to ask the CAISO to take this back and kind of think through, and I think the same ask for the CPUC Energy Division. If we were to do start talking about setting up a collaborative process for a recurring study like this concept, What are the things that are really important to you? And so that we could have additional conversations and kind of get into those details. I think for us, the biggest thing is mitigating the regulatory uncertainty of inconsistencies across the program. So the main goal is to get to a place where we have the same view of the need. I think who administers it, if there is a, as long, those are things that I think we need to get to. What is the CPUC and the CAISO feel most comfortable would be the right shared responsibility under this, and completely open to that. This visual, it was landed in the understanding that the CAISO had a strong preference for calculating it, and so put forward something under that lens. But if it's shifted, then I'm happy to talk and work with all parties to explore how we might be able to do something like this to mitigate regulatory uncertainty and to increase market confidence in the requirements and results.
So that takes us to actually 12:06. So we're running a little bit long. Deval, I think, should we say come back at 12:35? Well, let's do this. Well, why don't we just let's everyone come back at 12:30 with the understanding that some of you may still be eating.
Okay. All right.
Oh,
sounds good.
And I'm going to defer to Deval to do the policing in the afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah. So, because probably people had enough of me at this point. Yeah. So take it away.
Good tag team. Yes. Let's break and let's regroup at 12:30. Apologies for cutting short your half-hour lunch, but okay with us if folks are multitasking at that point. Thanks.
Yeah, we actually had a couple of questions queued up about LLE studies, so I think that was productive to have that discussion at the end, and may address some of the questions that were raised in chat.
Okay, see you guys all at 12:30.